Come on, Charlie, you know this.
In the world of mountaineering and climbing, where the peaks are high and the challenges even higher, there's an unspoken reverence for those who defy gravity and push the limits of human endurance.
Yeah!
But what happens when the heroes that we idolize hide dark secrets? All that glitters is not gold. This is the story of a well-known climber from Northern California that people say they knew, but in fact, he had a horrifying background of assaulting women and intimidating those who dared come forward to speak out against him. Soon those people who had once supported him would realize that in fact, Charles Barrett had become a monster. And now he's spending the rest of his life behind bars, in prison, for unspeakable crimes and horrors against women who made only the slightest misstep for having trusted him in the words that he told them. Viewer warning, this video covers some sensitive topics that might trigger some viewers. If you or someone you know has been impacted by sexual harassment or sexual assault, I'll put some resources in the description where you can find places to go to get some help. On January 31st of this year, Outside Online ran an 11,000-word expose on a very well-known and talented climber from Santa Rosa, California. His name was Charles Barrett. The article outed him as a serial sexual predator with a long history of violence, harassment, and intimidation. On February 13th, 2024, Barrett was found guilty by a federal jury in Sacramento of repeatedly, and I'm not even going to use the word in this, it's too vile, of repeatedly sexually assaulting a woman in August 2016, a 19-year-old woman at Yosemite National Park where he lived and worked at the time. Barrett was 39 when that took place. He had been charged with 2 counts of aggravated sexual abuse and 1 count of abusive sexual contact. And then the jury found him guilty on all counts, and now he is behind bars, sentenced to life in prison. And during that trial, 3 other women came forth to testify that Barrett had also sexually assaulted them. This Outside Online article was written by a journalist, Annette McGivney, and it looked into the life of Charles Barrett, and it raised troubling questions about the dangers women continue to face in the outdoors, and that goes for the climbing and mountaineering community. Some would ask, why cover this story now? Now, in the aftermath of the video that I posted 1 week previously to this video, there were many comments about a segment of that video that talked about a prominent mountaineer who had been featured in a New York Times article where 2 women came forward accusing him of sexual assault. And some of the commenters were so quick to shut down or point negatively at the women who, in my estimation, had great courage in coming forward to risk so much to speak out about something that took place in their lives with this said individual. And so it started bringing up this conversation and this idea of how can these things take place for so long with nobody ever doing anything about it. And it was evident in the comments of that video last week alone why women are so afraid to come forward. And I went through and deleted some of the most obtuse comments that do not belong on Everest Mystery. The article starts out by asking, how did this climber get away with so much for so long? And he was brought to trial and convicted as a serial offender with a shocking history of violence, harassment, and intimidation. So let's get into the heart of the story, starting with the Outside Online article. This article and subsequent follow-up articles were written by a journalist named Annette McGivney, who did an immense amount of background research. According to a lengthy report by a special agent for the National Park Service's Investigative Services Branch, Barrett initiated the first assault of his then 19-year-old victim by aggressively kissing her, not slowing down or stopping when she asked, ripping out her nose ring when she tried to create distance, and continuing even though she straightened out her arm and pressed it against his chest and told him to stop. Then Barrett, this is just chilling, strangled her to the point where she didn't know if she lost conscious or not, and then he sexually assaulted her according to the report. This went on throughout the weekend that this young woman was staying in Yosemite, where Barrett lived and worked at the time. Charles Barrett was 14 when he first showed up at the Santa Rosa's Vertex Climbing Center. Sarah McKay, she was the former general manager and then co-owner of the gym, remembers him as a funny, goofy, definitely charismatic, and blessed with natural climbing talent. McKay described the outside expose as shocking and devastating, and while expressing some compassion for Barrett's demons, he's depicted in court documents in the outside story as a binge drinker with mental health issues. And then McKay stated flatly, he is 100% responsible for his actions. He knew what he was doing and he made those choices. He's a monster, unfortunately. McKay goes on to say how it was only about a year into Barrett's climbing tenure, if you will, that he was catching up to all the others. And as you can see from some of this footage that is still on YouTube, that he was a very, very good climber. In the Outside Online article, it talks about Barrett was, when he was first arrested for sexually assaulting a fellow climber identified as KG in the court documents. KG testified that she initially connected with Barrett through Instagram in 2016, and he offered her advice on a weekend hiking trip that she was planning in Yosemite. After completing a solo day hike in August of 2016, KG met Barrett and his friends in Tuolumne Meadows, where he was working. She agreed to accompany Barrett to watch a meteor shower, but instead of rejoining the group of friends as she had expected, Barrett led KG into a remote forested area where he pushed her to the ground and strangled her. I'm going to leave it at that. She was 19 years old at the time. In the extensive investigation that Annette McGivney wrote for Outside, it was published shortly before the trial, and it detailed how Barrett stalked and harassed his victims, causing them to fear literally for their lives. And now this is some insight on why women, mostly women, are terrified to come forward to report about being sexually harassed or worse, because of the intimidation that they can often get from the perpetrator or the alleged perpetrator, and also the doubt and the scorn and the skepticism from people who don't believe that it's true. It's a big risk for people to come forward and talk about these things, but these articles and what happened to Charles Barrett hopefully is encouragement enough for people who have experienced this to come forward and report it, at least anonymously or privately, so they're not exposed to that person's potential intimidation tactics. In the Outside article, it goes on to say that over a 14-year period, 9 prosecution or restraining orders were filed against Barrett for incidents that involved harassment or assault of at least 6 women. They included death threats, trolling on Instagram, impersonating a police officer, and since his conviction, 2 additional females have been named in court documents. McGivney did endeavor to reach Barrett for an interview that was unsuccessful, as you can imagine, and his lawyers as well did not respond to the interview requests. So back to that whole idea of how does something get to a situation like this, and what is the psychology of people propping up stars or champion athletes as someone who is above it all. And that's the most troubling thing I can think of. You know, as somebody who's followed sports his entire life and a big fan of live music, I've seen people propped up as almost like beyond human, like godlike. And when that person does fall from grace, people are so shocked that this human being actually had a dark side or had faults. I think it's a bit of a situation where media and publicity and all the adoration of people endeavoring to become a better athlete themselves will put these people up on that pedestal and assign them some Teflon, if you will, some armor that they're not susceptible as the same faults and foibles as a normal human being. And then ultimately in there is a confirmation bias where once a person is elevated up on a high pedestal, there's often a tendency to ignore or downplay any negative aspects of that person, which was the case with Barrett countless times. Now, back when Barrett was initially arrested for this, the climbing community was aware of it. It went across social media, climbing websites, and chat forums, and many people wondered, is it really true about these allegations? Charlie seemed like such a nice guy. Why did the victim wait so long to report the assault? And then shortly after that, the author and climber Jon Krakauer weighed in, posting on his Instagram page about Barrett's arrest and urging other victims to contact police. And many females came forward expressing gratitude for him having done that. One person said, "Wow, I'm blown away that he's not able to hide behind the bro code and sweep it under the rug. Thanks for doing the unpopular thing and standing with women and helping get in front of victim shaming and blaming." But Krakauer, as he's known to do, pushed back against people who seemed to defend Barrett. Some posters complained that Krakauer's words were hurting Barrett's chances of getting a fair trial. Best to leave the police work to the police, he said, and please bear in mind, he might actually be innocent. Now, Krakauer comes back with something that we all need to keep in mind. He said, if Barrett had been arrested for different crime, I doubt you would be posting this. Sexual assault is probably the only crime in which the victim is assumed to be lying. You should be much more concerned about the victim getting a fair trial, not Barrett. Rapists almost always escape accountability. Amazing. Takes a lot of guts to come forward and say this, and that's why I appreciate journalists like Krakauer, because he's out there putting himself on the front line, willing to take the criticism despite the bro code that's out there, or despite this lingering thought that perhaps things are getting blown out of proportion. So here's a pretty interesting and actually quite amazing thing that took place when Barrett was working plea deals and trying to keep himself out of court and out of prison, is that in 2018, April of 2018, an amazing thing happened. These data scientists, if you will, jump-started the accountability for Barrett, who had spent an inordinate amount of time and apparently his own resources keeping out of prison or jail or out of court. They put together a survey with a former editor of Alpinist magazine, and they launched the Safe Outside survey with the purpose to learn more about sexual harassment and assault in the rock climbing community. More than 5,300 climbers took the survey, and as it said, 40% of the female respondents reported experiencing some form of sexual harassment or sexual assault while engaged in a climbing activity. 54 of the respondents of the survey had said that they had been sexually assaulted or worse. And in follow-up interviews, 2 women who reported having been sexually assaulted in California were asked who the perpetrator was, and both replied with hesitation that it was Charles Barrett. Now, this is the most amazing thing about this survey. These two victims were put in touch with one another. They provided emotional support and also discussed their reporting options. And in April 2020, one of the victims, who is listed as KG, reported Barrett's sexual assault to law enforcement, and a federal investigation was launched. And so in August 2022, as Barrett was making a plea deal to keep himself out of prison by pleading no contest, as he left the courtroom one day, he was arrested by federal authorities, and he's been incarcerated ever since. Following a 7-day trial, a jury unanimously found Barrett guilty on all counts, and he was ultimately sentenced to life in prison. So what have we learned from this cautionary tale of Charles Barrett, the people who had the courage to come forward and risk their own safety in order to put him behind bars? Well, one of the things that we know is that there are hidden dangers behind putting people up on pedestals. The charisma and the talents of Charles Barrett allowed him to get away with much more than any human being should ever be allotted. And the culture of silence and fear, how the victims are often very intimidated about speaking up about what's happened to them, and how their fear is very legitimate of being retaliated upon and being rejected by the greater community in which they climb or are a mountaineer. So if you or someone you know has been impacted by sexual harassment or worse in the climbing or outdoor community, there will be some information and resources that you can reach out to in the description of this video. And I also welcome your comments and would like to hear what you think about this story and what you think that people should do moving forward. I really appreciate you being here. Do a kind deed. Don't ask for anything in return. Make the world a better place, one tiny step at a time. Thanks for being here. Peace be with you, my friends.